Well, hello again, and this is our final session of the second day of WAF 2021, and I'm delighted to welcome Jeannie Gang to give this keynote address. And Jeannie is going to talk about how the specific issues that we face, the urgent issues that have really come to the fore in the last little while, climate change, social equity, and of course the pandemic, have in a sense combined and interacted to throw a very sharp lens on how we can, how architects might think about what they're doing and how we might use architecture and buildings to deal with some of these really urgent problems. And Jeannie is going to talk about some specific research that her practice Studio Gang, of which she's the founder partner, have been doing, looking at buildings of concrete buildings of, I think, the mid-20th century, and seeing how they might be repurposed as a way of introducing issues that might begin to help us resolve some of these urgent problems. So Jeannie, we're very interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, WAF, for this invitation to speak. It's always nice to be at this event, next time hopefully in person. You know, I got into architecture because I loved being creative, designing from my imagination, and I never thought that I'd someday be a proponent of saving old buildings. It wasn't what I initially had in mind. But today I just wanted to share why it's important and how these buildings can present really interesting opportunities for designers. That's our own building in Chicago. It's a great example. When we were about to move from our studio, our first studio, we asked the members in our office, you know, where they wanted to be, where they wanted to work in the city. And we were ready to move anywhere that people wanted to be. But we found out that most of everyone really wanted to stick around in our own neighborhood. That's in Wicker Park in Chicago. And we knew about this old bank building. It's a credit union really for the former Polish National Alliance, which was a group that welcomed immigrants coming from Poland to live in Chicago. And it was really like their first stop in the city. So it turned out to be this great opportunity to actually purchase the building. And we were competing against bidders, some of them who, you know, wanted to tear it down. And so luckily the owner didn't like that idea and decided to sell it to us, even though we were not the highest bidder. So I think buildings can really mean something important for communities. They can be community anchors, but to us also, they were an opportunity to use this building as a testing ground for various projects, experimental in nature. And we've done a lot of things inside of it and on top of it, including our eco roof there. And this year we just added solar photovoltaic panels on the upper roof. Today, we're really working in many old buildings that most architects probably do in our 4 offices, where we're striving to really just to be a local presence in each community. In my office, we really want to get to know the place where we are. So we're kind of both the kind of local and global office, I guess, at this point. But most people know us more for new buildings, like, you know, the Aqua Tower, which was completed in 2008, or currently we're working on completing this American Museum of Natural History in New York. It's still under construction. We've done higher education buildings like the University of Chicago. Let me get this going here. Their University of Chicago residence halls. And also some wood construction is what we're known for as well. This is the Arca Center for Social Justice Research, Social Justice Leadership, and as well as the Writers Theater Community Building. All of those were new construction buildings. But back to the idea of today, it's really about, you know, caring for our environment so much that we really want to see the creativity in reuse and repair, everything from the scale of just like reusing building materials to reusing actual buildings, existing buildings, and rediscovering parts of the city that have been abandoned. And the care can also spurn creativity in different ways than you would not find in new construction. In the modern building industry, we know now we have this kind of outsized role in producing greenhouse gases, and that's widely known. And you'll find difficulties and hurdles to specifying used materials. A lot of things work against it, like you'll hear things like, oh, it's more expensive and we can't warranty these materials. I want to go back to an early project first that really had to do, it was back in 2003, where this project for the Fort Calumet Environmental Center, which was a competition. It's really an essay on reusing the materials themselves. So it was a competition for environmental center located on the south side of Chicago in this kind of former industrial area where there were a plethora of building materials available and nearby. And so the concept of this idea was really to build a building like you would build a nest, not necessarily to look like one, but to really use the materials available and nearby to make it protective. So you see this screen that prevents migratory birds from striking the window glass, which was another discovery of the project. But I think the most radical part of it in retrospect, and the most difficult part, was how to design things using reused materials like these column clusters. This was a little model of the column clusters. The idea here was to make use of whatever steel sections would be available on the secondhand market. And so these little models show the column clusters that had to be engineered to work for a variety of shapes of steel sections, using the idea of secondhand steel that's rejected for flash rusting or because it's the wrong size. Instead of melting it down and all the way down to nothing and back forming it again, this was really to say, let's use secondhand steel, whatever is available at the time when the contractor wants to order it. So the engineering was very innovative, and as well as the concept of the delivery. And so, there we go. We can see the basket-like mesh that is enclosing this porch that protects the birds from clashing with the window glass, but it's also holding up the porch. And really, this building is really used to work with the environment in its plan and in all of its systems. It's really in synthesis with the environment. Unfortunately, never built, but many lessons learned from that project, as well as another early project that thought about reuse in a different way. This was the SOS Community Center project on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood where we used a different type of reuse. It was about reusing things that were potentially new, but that were going to be thrown out. So it had a very small budget, and we were supposed to use materials that people and organizations wanted to donate. This map shows where the project is. Well, if you can see that dot on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side, you see a demographic map of the city, and on the right-hand side, you see the AIA's guide to interesting architecture, where all the little tick marks are the interesting architecture. And what we realized in kind of mapping this project was that the sand colored areas in that map on the right, they probably did have interesting architecture, but it wasn't recognized as such. And it was, we thought about how can we find that interesting architecture in those areas for communities, but also add to these areas with new projects in communities. And so the challenge of this project was really to work with these donations. And it was about finding tactics of how to do that when they were constantly changing. So making a grid of everything that was available, services and materials, but also an Excel spreadsheet, which was invaluable for tracking the donations. And then it gave us an idea to pursue our own donations from contractors. We had the idea of pursuing, it was like a building boom at the time in Chicago, and to reach out to big projects in the downtown and see if we could get donations of concrete. Typically, after the day's end of concrete is poured in the high rise, they'll go back and dump out the rest of the concrete on site. And so we thought, what if we could get a hold of these donations and make a wall that would really highlight and represent donations. It had to be actually, again, engineered to make the mix of different types of concrete work together. And the logistics were difficult to figure out. But we ended up being able to do this, and the logistics and everything, and made this kind of amazing strata wall, a wall that really makes visible the discarded materials and elevates them. But I think the beauty of the project is really in the social cohesion that's created in this neighborhood building and the positive effect it had on its community. So changing gears, we think about this last year, and over the past year, we've had these highly visible effects of extreme weather, the strength of the social justice movement, the pandemic, all of these things combined and led people around the world to really evaluate history, and as well as the built environment with a much sharper critical lens. And so it's now, obviously urgent to work on reuse. And I think it's both from the climate perspective, but also the social cohesion perspective. And if we think about the embodied carbon, which is really the most urgent part right now, we've been doing pretty well on lowering emissions from energy use, but now it's the embodied carbon that is the target that we really have to reduce. If you look at the bar graph, you can see that renovations on the far right are much lighter and less emitting than new construction, obviously, and new construction, the bulk of the CO2 emissions is in the structure itself. So this makes really a strong case for building reuse. But I also want to mention that it's important to look at each building and really evaluate it on its own terms, because I have seen cases where the repair of an older building actually does calculate out to be more emissive, but that's a rarity. But I do think it's important to look into the reality of each project. So I really wanted to share this story about reuse and repair that can be applied in interesting ways to old buildings. And I'm not talking about strict preservation, but rather thinking about how the buildings can be reinvented for totally new uses and adapted in new ways. So it's really the story of this coal burning power plant in Beloit, Wisconsin, along the Rock River. And you can see it was built in 1908, but this is it depicted in a postcard in the 1930s, along with this dam that was used to produce power and light for Beloit, Wisconsin. So it was a crucial infrastructure element in the city, and then it became, of course, a source of pollution and also illness and dangerous for people's health ultimately. This is a diagram that shows also really interesting thing. This college nearby on a hill on the same side of the river where Beloit, Wisconsin is on the east side of this river. And one of the things I like about designing with older buildings is really like trying to understand their history as well as their internal logic. It's a little like, being a detective, I guess, but reimagining these strategies that the original architect, and maybe in this case an engineer, might have had, and either challenging those strategies or taking them on and pursuing the next move for the building with a strategy, with a position, with a point of view. So in this case, we saw that there was a kind of a logic that explained the linear step-by-step adding on to create more power over the years, adding on to the north, kind of like links in a chain. And in this black and white photo, you can see something interesting. Like this is a view from the riverside, which, is really the main facade of the building. So suddenly we realized that all this effort of the design, the type, the way that the windows were arranged, the way that it was designed was really focused on its image from the river, which is interesting because the only approach at that time from the river was from this train line. In 2013, when we were first asked to reimagine the building, this is the facade that we first saw, which is on the road side, on the college side. And you can see it was in disrepair, but also interestingly, this kind of add-on of the 1970s scrubbers. They were required by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to reduce the emitted pollution out of the top. So there were even additions showing up onto this building till the 1970s. So in this final kind of diagram of our strategy, we added on in this linear way to the existing logic, but also we found that doing that would allow us to have a community-centered field house on the north side, right next to that park in the upper right. So this is a building for the college who really wanted to do something ironic. They wanted a health center, a recreation center, and a student union put into this former, coal burning power plant. But we also saw an opportunity to create a community anchor by putting the field house in that location next to this outdoor recreation area, which is used sometimes for concerts. And so in summertime, this building can swing over and become a community building, as well as the opportunity to add to the Riverwalk and to create a bridge to create an accessible entry to the building, which it previously was not accessible from the college. So in this final diagram, you can see inside all the different uses and this track that's a kind of belt tying together the different additions, and all the different ways of using what was already there, the existing steel inside, the setup of the logic of the building, but reorienting it toward this public use. And so to reduce the operational carbon, we were using the river water, and we are using the river water, and a lot of strategies to reduce the overall energy use. One thing really interesting about this building is just so big, it could be expensive to heat. So it was very important to work together with the engineers to understand the, how the extra size, how heat would be stratified in the space and to reduce the energy use that way. As well as just showing you the amount of steel structure inside that could be reused to build our new floors. So it's always about, it's just a motto, start with what's there. These are some cool pictures, but you can also see it was in pretty bad shape when we came upon it. And here it is, in its like today's state and open, and really served the college well during the pandemic because of its size. People were able to spread out, and now it is really starting to come into its own as a community anchor. And if you think about it, if this building were not made to be reused, it would be a huge blight along the riverfront, because when things sit there disused and abandoned, it can really have the opposite negative effect. So I think it's really important to reconsider, especially these industrial scale buildings, as community anchors, and to reduce the embodied carbon that went into the building when it was made, to kind of sequester that and keep it sequestered within the building. That's the field house there. And here is this bridge that takes you over to a publicly accessible elevator that's always open. So people can now reach the building and use it like a machine to vertically move up and down within it. Here's a picture of the bridge and inside the running track. And you can just kind of see the scale of this, and the steel structure inside now supporting new floors. And finally, the pool. So thinking of this coal burning power plant as like a competitive swimming pool is just pretty exciting, and it wouldn't have been the same had we started from new construction. So now I just want to move on to like these mid-century buildings, and this has been the focus of research within the office, but also as at my role as a professor in practice at Harvard Graduate School of Design. But it kind of started out with this interesting building here. This is Burton Goldberg's Prentice Hospital, which was actually built in 1975, but he had been working with the material concrete for a long time. And his work would be, I guess, what some people would call brutalist. But we know that brutalist architecture, there are entire websites devoted to kind of hating on concrete buildings. This one called Awful Architecture with all kinds of examples of buildings that are made of concrete. You know, it was Rayner Banham who really popularized the term brutalism for an architecture that was, in his view, it was something that really expressed the structure and articulated the function directly. And the association with concrete really wasn't necessary. He didn't think that it had to be concrete. That really came along with Corbusier's work, who famously embraced the rough quality of his post-war concrete buildings, and he called it béton brut. And so the association of brutalism with concrete was really coming a bit later. But architects, of course, on the other hand, really love concrete buildings, and you can see tons of websites and Pinterest pages and Instagrams devoted to brutalism, and it's so photographic in black and white, and you can even find maps now in many cities that indicate the buildings that are there that are brutalist buildings. But so there is this kind of love-hate relationship with it, and that's what really started my concern, because I was thinking that there are so many buildings that are of this era that could be like reimagined or reused. I started with the Prentice Hospital, and it was like kind of the first foray, as I said, and I found out that this local university that owned it with their hospital was about to tear it down, and it was like this famous, this cloverleaf building. And I was really sure that the building could be reused, and I started dreaming about it. It was one of my favorite buildings. But it wasn't until New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman was visiting Chicago, and I showed it to him. He challenged me to think about what it could be. And so we took it back to the studio, and we started to think about this building almost in a way you would think about Rome, like adding on top of it. And this was the idea that we called the stack effect. So we were taking the program of what the university hospital wanted, which was labs, and we were applying it to the top of this building. So it kind of palimpsest of buildings, and we called it the stack solution. And then this really, of course, I would say it's a sad ending to the story. This is a series of photographs where you can see that it didn't work, and they started tearing it down, and it's gone, and there's a really banal glass building in its place. But a lot of architects started to get energized by this loss, and to think about these important buildings. But like I said, there's so many other buildings that are not this iconic, but are coming to this point in their life where this is a whole photo series of banks in the US that you could call brutal. But I started to call them concrete architecture. It's been pointed out that the word brutalism might have something to do with why people want to get rid of these buildings. So this is just a whole series, and we've been kind of trying to quantify the amount of carbon that is kind of like spent when these buildings were built, and why it would be important to hang on to them, and trying to think of new interesting uses and how they could be reinvented, because of course they're a little bit less iconic, and there's more freedom, I guess, in a certain way to design with them. With the studio at Harvard, I've given the students these projects. This building circled there in the center of the screen is called the Swope Center, and it's at the University of Chicago campus called the Marine Biology Labs in Woods Hole in Massachusetts. So in addition to being endangered from being torn down as a brutalist building, it's also really at the forefront of sea level rise. And the students had some really interesting ideas about what to do with this one. You can see the contrast between it and the neighboring surroundings. And then another studio, we looked at Paris La Défense, and this is the Damier building, which is a very large group of 4 L-shaped structures that were housing some of the few housing projects that were built in La Défense at the time. And here we looked at how these could be reused and reinvented. Here's a picture of how it looks today. And unfortunately, one of these I think is already being dismantled, but the time is really now for looking at these buildings built between 1945 and 1980. And more buildings were built between 1945 and 1980 as all architecture ever built globally has been constructed prior to that. So it's a huge amount of buildings. This isn't just another view of the Damiers. And so, concrete, of course, is enemy number one when it comes to climate change and emissions. But I'm going to talk about this 2 buildings that we're currently working on, but also kind of hit on what the possibilities for concrete are going forward, and just hoping to inspire you all to start looking for these anonymous buildings and making them into interesting buildings in the future. This is the Seaholm Waterfront project in Austin, Texas. It's more industrial, but it also qualifies as a brutalist building, I guess you could say. And it was really a water intake vehicle for a factory nearby, but it happens to be on this Lady Bird Lake, which is a very popular recreational area. And it was pretty much in danger of being pulled down. And we got together with some other architects in the Austin area, and what we were brought in to kind of do much more of a listening session and to understand what people were in the neighborhood were really looking for in this building. Is it just about preservation, or is it really also about strengthening the connection to the surroundings and to Austin? That's just a view of both the water side and the street side elevations of this plant. And so this was really so much about the process, like to get people's feelings about it, and that didn't happen at Prentice. That was a very closed process, and so we architects were on the outside, kind of. But this is really about getting people's reactions to the building and building a cohort of supporters and people that want to see a new future for this small little building. And again, start with what's there. It was a building that was taking in water from the river and cooling it. There's a lot of interesting features in the building, and really trying to understand what the architect had in mind, and what the potential was to reimagine it on an everyday basis for this community, because that's something that they really expressed, to special events and maybe exhibitions and every now and then, but make it possible for the building to transform for bigger events on occasion. And that flexibility was what was really important to them. And so with this project, which also goes along with a restoration along the edges of Lady Bird Lake, we could find a new community anchor that's creating a social cohesion within its neighborhood. And then this last one I want to talk about is an interesting project that we have on the boards right now in San Jose. It's both a new building and a kind of reimagining of an existing office building that's of the so-called brutalist era, the Davidson building. And San Jose, as some of you probably know, it's really where a lot of innovation companies are happening, and it's really the Silicon Valley area, but it's also historically it was a place for a very fertile area for orchards and growing food, and over time it just became this sprawling urban place with highways and roads and pretty much paved over with the concrete. So our structure, when we first began the project, we were given a site, but there was next door to it, there was this kind of ugly, I would say, concrete building that we, together with our client, decided to try to integrate into our project and to reuse it. And so the new building is the larger one, but the existing office building we're trying to reimagine. We tried to make the case. We did take apart the entire building and see how much carbon was already in it and how much we would save by keeping the building instead of replacing it on that site or expanding the new building to take over that site. And it was a significant amount of carbon held within it. Here it is in all of its glory. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, the fun thing about reimagining buildings, you kind of can create your own story. Unfortunately, the architect, we would have spoken with the architect, but he passed away, so we didn't get to get the true story of the building. So it left us kind of to our own imagination of what was going on with this building. And the thing that struck me first was this big pie symbol that is the concrete part of the building. And we just said, what actually went down with this building? We found out that the building was actually a steel building on the inside. And so we started imagining that maybe the architect, his initial dream was to have this concrete pies that would hold the floors between them, acting as structure, because maybe that's what I would have done if I was thinking about this building. But then probably when they went into, the cost of the building, it became clear that it had to be a steel building. And of course, this is a total fiction. I'm just telling you our story that we imagined. And when we went inside, we found those really important places of where the pie horizontal changes over to a vertical were kind of in closets and behind kitchenettes. And if you look in the middle photo, that niche in the wall, that is the leg of one of the pies. So it was really uncelebrated. So we felt that probably the architect didn't get to fulfill his dream, or he wasn't a good architect, I don't know. But we wanted to bring new life to the pie symbol and start to inhabit it in interesting ways. And so in this view, you can see a diagram of our new building in the back, and then pie in the front, where the legs of the pie will become these new little Zoom rooms with tiny windows in them where people can do Zoom meetings. And then the top of the pie symbol becomes a carved out garden. And in between the pie legs are new outdoor spaces for this office building to kind of break out into the space around it. And so again, I think it's really about this kind of, it's a fiction, but it's a way to have fun with and to breathe new life into an existing building and keep its carbon intact. Here's a view of the Davidson building, and on the left you can see it, and connecting to Arbor, which is our new, and this is a wood structure with a very low carbon footprint, and lots of indoor and outdoor spaces for a work environment. And what we've done is connect the two on the roof so they can take advantage of each other. And here is a view of the building from the ground, looking at the Davidson building in the foreground with Arbor in the background. Okay, so finally, just to conclude, you know, I don't want to give up on concrete. Concrete is such an important building material for all of us, and it's also something that I love the fluidity of it. I love the things that you can do with it. It's also an important material for many parts of the world that don't have a steel industry or other developed wood industries. So there is another project that needs to be done, which is to drill down on what is the carbon in concrete itself and how can we reduce it. I know that people think that there's a lot of greenwashing going on about concrete being green, but in fact, there is a lot of innovation going on around concrete, and I feel it is really verging. It needs architects to advocate for getting this low emitting concrete. But you can see in this bar graph that the CO2 emissions, that's embodied carbon between traditional concrete and what these new materials are, which are some of them, it's geopolymers that are being used, and also alkali activated materials to replace Portland cement. And you can, it's like an 80% reduction in the emissions if we can get there. So specifying this and getting that up to speed and to scale is really crucial. Another thing that we have known about for a while is to replace the aggregates with approved, you know, waste materials, and that also has the double impact of reusing materials, but using it within concrete. And finally, there's also this aspect of, capturing the CO2 emissions from the concrete when it's curing and injecting that back into the material. And what that does is, and this is, you know, this is a technology that is available and being used, it mineralizes the CO2 and turns, you know, helps cure the concrete and then sequesters it forever within the building. So these are three things I think what we're planning to do on this next project, which I'm going to go through very fast so we have time to talk afterwards, is to integrate all three of those techniques on new concrete for this C40 competition winning project for workforce housing in downtown Chicago, in Chicago's Loop. So if you don't know, C40 is a group of 40 cities that are this cohort of cities that really wants to make progress in environmental design and also social equity. And so our proposal here was for housing for people that are essential workforce working the Loop but have never been able to afford living near their workplace before. So the housing, the units are a fraction of what it would cost to build market rate housing. And then we're doing that in this building that is net zero approach. And so we're working on every level to try to reduce the carbon, the embodied carbon, but also the operational carbon of the project, but creating these affordable units, but with a base that connects to the park. And it's a base that really includes community organizing space for the public and community groups to utilize and rent. And that was all came about from engaging with the potential users of the building. So here you can see there's currently a park on the site on the left, and we're redesigning this park that was and integrating it, pulling it into the building and really creating a public space, public restrooms, public meeting spaces, and a grocer and other things that are needed in the Loop area and for the tenants. And here's another view. So the thing about this building is in a very, very important historically part of Chicago, and where other buildings from the Chicago School are built. And there's not a lot of room, let's say, to put photovoltaics to get the energy use down, but we've created a network with the developers, other buildings around, to create a whole system of energy production on all of their sites. Then we're using this, really trying to get multi-directional day lighting into the spaces, creating studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. So it also includes places for family, but creating this envelope that's very lightweight, and trying to reduce the weight of the building overall, even though it's using concrete. Here's some of the other neighboring buildings of the Chicago School. So it's kind of a lot of pressure to put this type of building in this incredibly important historical area. So the bay windows are kind of the way that we are connecting in dialogue with those older buildings. Here's a little model of what we've made. And the components that go into creating what will be a lightweight version of the terracotta facades, but not using terracotta, to really reduce the weight of this building on its site. So in general, we're trying to make this a less embodied carbon. We are working on this number to bring it even further down by using some of the newer materials that I talked about earlier, but to make it an example and something that's replicable on a larger scale, as opposed to going with a wood structure in this case, which is, like I said, not really available in a lot of markets. And so this was just one this year in 2021, and we're getting excited to get started on this building. So again, I think it's really about thinking of buildings in different ways, and designers are really the ones who can think about and imagine how to work with older buildings, but how to work with new buildings to create these contemporary structures that work for our society and work towards a more inclusive and resilient future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeannie. That's stimulating and I think very challenging message that you've put across. And just to kick off, I think some of the ways you talk about the buildings, particularly the large ones, the Beloit Power Station, for example, it's almost as if it is a quarter of a city in its own right. I mean, it's obviously got a lot of things happening in it, and that was very much what the client wanted. It is both for the college and for the community. And I just wonder if the way you refer to buildings evolving and having a new life, and you trying to find what that could be, whether that could also apply to thinking about whole urban areas, because of course urban areas go in cycles. And I guess your own studio building in Chicago was an area where Polish people moved to when they came to Chicago from Poland. Now, I don't know if there's still a Polish community there, but I know in Chicago quite a lot of those communities have moved on, generally to the suburbs. And so I just wonder if there isn't some sort of affinity, and if so, how one might tease it out between the way urban districts evolve and buildings within them might evolve.
It's a great question. I didn't have really time to go into some of our urban work today, but I think that's a great moment to especially with areas where you have had a lot of tearing down of buildings, or you've had blight or urban renewal, where you've lost a lot of the original fabric. In Chicago, this summer we worked on a project where really on the West Garfield Park, which is a part of the city that was once vibrant and thriving with Black and brown residents and Black businesses, and it really was an important part of the city as a neighborhood. And then there were the 1960s and the assassination of Martin Luther King, Dr. King, and there were riots, and the way that the city dealt with it at that time was to tear things down and create big wide swaths of roads going through this area, and really kind of destroyed the vibrancy and fabric of the area in doing so. Okay, so fast forward to today, how do you even approach working in a part of the city like that? And we were asked by the city of Chicago, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, to help lead a process to reimagine a couple of the blocks in that part of the city. And it was an interesting process we've been using, which is engaging with community leaders and community activists, and reaching out to different groups to really ask them what they see as a possibility for the neighborhood. And, this is just a different way of working than what used to be taught in architecture school, but to really ask people what they want and to help them to be part of this process and to co-create what comes next. And we targeted an area where the city really wanted to improve safety for kids walking to school, and identified a few sites that were linked. And what came out of it was really the neighbors' desire for activating an empty lot. And the idea that they had was to create a roller rink, an outdoor roller skating rink. And I heard the mayor was pretty shocked when she heard what they wanted. She didn't imagine that that's what would come out of it, but that was the idea. And what our role in that as architects was facilitating that process, and and identifying for other architects and landscape designers what the potential projects could be. So I see that as an act of design as well, and also identifying older buildings that could be reimagined, ones that would be otherwise probably torn down, and because these are really important to the communities. So in that project, we now have we'll have a roller rink, and then we have an old library that will become renewed, and it's a similar process to what we've done in some other cities, like in New York, in Brownsville, and Morrisania, which is in the Bronx. So it's kind of this. It does work on every scale, Jeremy. I mean, it's not only about the building; it's really about thinking about the relationships between all the different things.
I'm also very interested in the idea that when you work with the community, they come up with something that might have surprised you, and it certainly seems to have surprised the mayor, that's what the people in the area think is really significant. And I'm reminded of an anecdote about the creation of Covent Garden here in London, 400 years ago, where the client, the then Earl of Bedford, said that he was forced to build a church as part of this development, which he saw as a way of making money. And he said to the architect, Inigo Jones, "I don't want anything other than a barn for the church." And Inigo Jones is alleged to have replied to him, "Then you shall have the finest barn in Europe." So you're giving these people the finest roller rink in North America, or whatever it is. So there are possibilities, even if you take something like that and you can imagine it in a particular way, it seems to me.
Yeah, and there's this kind of work. It's not mutually exclusive. You can go and do projects that are brand new as well, and be working on these different realms, with different groups. And for my practice, I've always really enjoyed that mix, as you know, Jeremy, and working on different scales. But always trying to figure out how the things are related. And yes, the design is important. Like you want to create something that people will go out of their way to go see, and it does create this in a neighborhood that maybe hasn't seen new buildings in a while, or new even any new activity. it's really a source of pride, especially if they were involved and helped think of what it is. So yeah, it's very, it's a great, it's satisfying, and it's something that's, like I tried to demonstrate in the talk, kind of crucial right now, um, in cities, in American cities, and I think also in other places around the world.
And also, of course, when you're designing, you have to have some ideas to work with. And those ideas can come from all sorts of random sources. They can come from a chance remark that someone makes to you. They can come from, you know, a very aggressive, you know, social interaction you might have with people. Or it might come from looking at a painting. I mean, there is no limit, and there shouldn't be any limit to where what one can use as a starting point. And it's then, whether it's a good starting point or not, is only provable through the design process and through the construction process. Only once you have shown what you can do with it that one can say, yes, that was a good idea or a bad idea, it seems to me.
Well, I think that you have much better chance as an architect to have your projects be successful if there is the support for them, the community support. I mean, I'm one that wants to build and wants to get things done, and and I found that I can have, you know, support through this engaging process, which actually helps you get the project achieved, as opposed to, you know, trying to do it in the back room somewhere and concocting a project that is really a top-down kind of project. Even even for a museum or other programs like the I showed the San Jose office building complex. We worked together with the community there, just to engage some youth. We started a design youth leadership program, which the first time doing it in Memphis, but then we did another one there in San Jose, and our client was really happy to. It was exciting to see a developer client really engage with the local neighborhood community and try to engage them in the design, trying to increase the amount of and different kinds of people that are exposed to design careers, is also something that's really important right now. We know that we are a profession that's kind of, you know, very white and very privileged, I would say, and it's really important overall to have our profession represent many more different kinds of people with different backgrounds and different experiences, and that is what I want to work on in this coming year, and really improve our own pipeline of diversity within our office, and create better opportunities for people. And it's a value. It's a value of bringing new ideas into the studio.
Absolutely. But do you find that creating, even if they are complete fiction, narratives such as you were talking about with the Davidson building in San Jose, about what you might have imagined the architect was doing, given that he was no longer around to discuss it with, if you perhaps had spoken to some community, some people in the local community, that you felt there was some value in that building, they might have said, no, it's terrible, tear it down, we don't really care about the carbon. But if you can invent a narrative that allows them to develop a level of empathy with it, is that a way of helping to get the community on your side and to understand what you're trying to do?
It's really well put, Jeremy. It's really, I mean, people respond to stories of, and the first is to listen to their stories, and then you can, you know, start to relate. but the buildings themselves also have a story, and I think it's a great way to connect people to buildings that, as I pointed out, a lot of buildings that people love to hate, especially brutalist buildings. So I think, yeah, it's true. I wasn't really thinking about that when we came up with the story. It was just like, how do we act with this building? How do we? But it does make it somehow more compelling once you think about what the architect went through, what the difficulties that they encountered on that, with that building that ended up being the motif of a pie instead of the structure of a pie.
Yes, I think, I mean, one other thing, slight change of gear that fascinates me in the final project you showed, the C40 building in the Chicago Loop, that, as you were saying, it's a very tight site. You can't do a lot of, as it were, on-site power generation, photovoltaics, but you were looking at sites the developer owns to bring them together, almost, I mean, creating a sort of district power generation system. Is that something is that a bit of a one-off, or is that something that you can apply in other projects as well?
Yeah, no, I think in that case, I think it could be applied to other projects. It worked well with a developer, in this case, who already had built a number of community projects and dispersed. And so the benefit of the solar installations, which are offsetting each of those properties' electrical bills, but the installation is going towards offsetting our carbon of the C40 project. I think it's a really interesting way, another demonstration of thinking about relationships and looking beyond what the plot that you're given, and think about the organization, you know, that you're working with, and what their resources are, and what you can do together as the architect, not just in drawing up a building, but really thinking of how it relates to all the different moving parts. And that's when you similar to the first project I showed, or the second project at the SOS Community Center, where we started getting involved with acquiring the donations for the building, not just being frustrated by, you know, seeing how they could be deployed. So I think that's, yeah, it's a mode of working that's really more about looking for all of your opportunities from an organizational standpoint, from a resources standpoint, and trying to bring that to bear to make a better building.
That was, I think, a very elegant way of putting what I was just about to ask, which is, it seems to me that a lot of what you're doing is about precisely identifying assets, opportunities on the site, off the site, whether they're things that people donate you, like the contractor samples that you then use in a building. And I think that's a sort of, what would one call it, a totem of how architecture might progress, because in the end, what you're trying to do, it seems to me, as architects, what architecture should try to do is to give people opportunities that they didn't otherwise think they had, so that they can then you know, develop some sort of level of achievement and satisfaction for themselves. Now, that may be, in some probably quite rare cases, a moment of wonder at looking at some magnificent building or some magnificent setting. But on the whole, particularly when we're talking about where people live and work and where they shop or where they learn, or, you know, the buildings that we all use every day, it's about the opportunities that come through what that building offers. And I think if you can show how, you know, as you were saying, broadening the sort of people who you work with, your colleagues, they will bring new and fresh ideas, and they'll bring new insights that you can then weave together somehow. You can weave the ideas with the physical spaces and the physical forms in a way that hopefully can move things forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not a threat to design to engage. It's really, it's an opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming to an end, and I would like to say that I think that's a very good note to end this on, that we're talking about opportunity, not about threats. Jeannie, thank you very much for a typically insightful and very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, we have now come to the end of today's World Architecture Festival. And it just remains for me to make a couple of announcements about things that are happening today, the rest of today and tomorrow, and for the rest of the festival. The first one is a reminder about the prize draw being offered by our founder partners, our big supporters, Grower. They have 100 rainwater smart active hand showers, which can be won. And all you have to do to be in with the chance of winning is to go onto the home page on this portal and click the link to register. And then that will automatically be processed. And if you're lucky, you will get one of these rainwater smart active hand showers. So good luck. And that's all you have to do. Now, then turning to tomorrow, which will be the final day of the 2021 festival, and you'll see presentations by all the category winners, which have been judged over the previous few weeks. Some of you will have either presented or judged, or indeed in some cases you will have done both. And they of course compete for our 4 Best in Show awards, which are future projects, landscape, interiors and completed buildings. Now there's a great deal to get through, so we're going to start earlier than we have either today or yesterday. We're going to start at 8 o'clock London time. Now don't worry if that is a completely impossible time because of where you live or because you've got other things to be doing at that time, because everything will be available on catch-up from the following day, or probably this will be next week because of the weekend. And also don't worry if you want to see projects which are being presented in different streams, because you can switch from one stream to another. And of course, if the projects you want to see clash in time, you can catch one of them on catch up later. So hopefully there'll be enough to interest people for at least some of the day. And then the day will conclude with our final award ceremony, which will be just after 6 tomorrow evening London time, 6:05 in London evening. So we have a full day of judging from 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and then if you want to, you will see who has actually won the final awards. So again, if I may say thank you to all our speakers and contributors today. I think we've had a very rich day, and thank you all for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and look forward to tomorrow, and hopefully there'll be a level of equal interest in a rather different sort of program for tomorrow. So good night, and thank you very much.